Today, I'm delighted to welcome our featured speaker, Glenn Cohen, JD Class of 2003, Professor of Law and Faculty Director of the Petrie-Flom Center for Health Law Policy, Biotechnology, and Bioethics. In addition to teaching civil procedure, Professor Cohen is one of the world's leading experts on the intersection of bioethics, sometimes also called medical ethics and the law, as well as health law. Professor Cohen has spoken at several legal, medical, and industry conferences around the world, and his work has been covered in major print, television, and radio media outlets. Professor Cohen's current projects relate to big data, health information technologies, mobile health, reproduction, reproductive technology, research ethics, organ transplantation, rationing in law and medicine, health policy, FDA law, translational medicine, and to medical tourism. The travel of patients who are residents of one country, the home country, to another country, the destination country, for medical treatment. He is the author of more than 80 articles and the editor-author of 7 books. Professor Cohen is the editor of the Globalization of Healthcare, Legal and Ethical Issues, and the author of Patients with Passports, Medical Tourism, Law, and Ethics, with 2 other books in progress. All participants in today's HLex open lecture will have the opportunity to submit questions. Please use the questions panel on your screen at any time during the presentation. We will be addressing questions at the end of Professor Cohen's presentation. Professor Cohen, welcome.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a real pleasure to talk to you today. I'm going to give you kind of a smorgasbord of topics I've been working on, and we'll have lots of time in the Q&A to talk more. So the first one, I just want to make sure I can advance the slides okay. Let's see, there we go. The first one is just talk a little bit about big data. So what is big data? Usually the 3 V's, volume, large size of data, variety, very different kinds of data, and velocity, the speed at which we can process the data. We just did a big conference on big data and healthcare and law at the Petrie-Flom Center 2 weeks ago, and you can find that online. But I'm going to talk about one specific piece of this, which has to do with what's called predictive analytics. So predictive analytics is the use of electronic algorithms that forecast future events in real time. As applied to healthcare, it's basically the ability to use big data, vast real-time data sets, such as those collected in electronic health record systems, to improve patients' outcomes and lower healthcare costs in conjunction with targeted care. But it raises a series of legal and ethical challenges that I want to talk about. So first of all, let me give a hypothetical use case. There are many possible use cases. Probably the most current one that's actually being done today is readmission. Use computer algorithms to predict who's likely to require hospital readmission and focus follow-up care, home visits on that segment, take advantage of, among other things, the bonuses for reducing readmission in the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare. But you can imagine others reducing antibiotic use that's unnecessary by predicting which infants are likely to suffer from early onset sepsis using maternal data with infants' vital data. Use it to predict which patients are likely to have adverse events from a particular medication when you try to decide what to prescribe. And I'm going to give one that's a little bit more involved, it's a little more futuristic and a little more controversial. So imagine you've got a doctor who's trying to decide whether to send a patient with moderate organ dysfunction to the ICU. The patient could benefit from a stay in the ICU, but there's lots of patients vying for ICU beds, and ICU beds are limited. An evaluation of the first patient's risk of cardiopulmonary arrest or other preventable serious adverse events could take hours, and the prognostic accuracy, discrimination, inter-rater reliability, all of these would be relatively poor. Now imagine instead you had a technology that could ascertain that risk accurately for 1,000 separate patients and continuously update that evaluation every minute to help a physician decide who should go in and come out from the ICU bed. Well, the goal is to basically try to use technology from big data and harness it for this. So I like to say that there are 4 phases you'd have to do in order to accomplish this. And let me start by talking about the first. Each of them raises ethical and legal questions. The first is acquiring the data. So we're talking about millions and millions of electronic health records of individual patients that contain both narrative and structured data like nurses' notes, laboratory and physiological data, as well as other kind of patient information. Should patients explicitly have to consent to the use of their data to build the kinds of models we're talking about? So what I've argued elsewhere, we can discuss in the Q&A, is that essentially we should be able to do this without explicit consent, provided that developers comply with federal regulations regarding research on human subjects and privacy of health information. And here I think the way to think about this is a kind of triangle between consent, data protection, and governance. And the idea is the more data protection, the more de-identification we can give patients to their data, the more aggregation, and the more governance we can give patient groups and how these systems run, and chartering commissions and kind of trust models, for example, the less explicit consent you need. We think you still need notification, so we want to basically tell patients this is happening, tell them that if you join my practice, your data will be used to build these large big data kind of engines, predictive analytics engines, but beyond that we don't think we need explicit consent. But we think that's justifiable only if you're basically going to protect patients against data breaches. As all of us know, healthcare data is very valuable. Indeed, in the dark web black markets for data, it turns out that healthcare data is pay more dollars per terabyte of data for healthcare data than you do for credit card data, for example. So incredibly valuable. Lots of hacks occur. And we think there needs to be mechanisms in place and recourse for patients should they suffer adverse events when there's a data breach. Things like identity protection kinds of services, credit reporting, monitoring, and the like. That's the first phase of the data, and we think it's really important to engage patients in this, acquiring the data to build a model. The second phase is the idea of building and validating a model. So again, the big issues here are how patients can be involved in governance and design. And we think looking at models used for trust, for biospecimens, so the trust model of a trustee, settler, those kinds of things could be a valuable legal way of thinking about this. We also think there's very difficult questions relating to validation of the algorithms. So how do you know whether the algorithm you're going to deploy to try to decide who gets more follow-up care or who gets into the ICU? How do you know it actually works? What standard of validation is appropriate? The more rigorous you require it to be, so pre-specified outcomes, analysis plans, derivation, validation, we think that's appropriate where you're talking about substantial risk to patients. For example, if the model's predictions could direct clinicians to withhold interventions recommended by current evidence-based practice for medicine. In contrast, if the concern of the misclassification is that an individual will just be offered extra services that maybe they didn't need, we think something less in terms of validation may be possible. But here there's a really difficult intellectual property problem, which is the key coefficients for the algorithm and the way the algorithm works tends to be protected by trade secrecy law. And there are questions about how doctors will trust black box medicine. If you can't look under the hood, how do you know whether this is giving you appropriate advice as a physician? What's the impact on your liability, which I'll talk about in a moment. And here we think the best way to kind of deal with this is through third-party validations with non-disclosure agreements as opposed to government oversight or the like. I will flag, though, the problem of machine learning, which is many of these predictive engines work on machine learning. So it's not the case that I, as someone who works on it, can tell you exactly how the model knows what it knows. So IBM's Watson, that won Jeopardy, for example, is a good example. And when you have that kind of a model, it's very challenging to figure out who possibly could validate it. So this is something that we're struggling with as we think about black box medicine. Okay. The third phase is testing the model in real-world settings, right? So here there are issues, again, of consent, questions about liability, and questions of choice architecture. So the first question is, does a patient have to give explicit consent when you, the physician, are making decisions about the patient's care guided by a predictive analytics engine with decision support software? And our answer essentially is no. We think currently physicians make these kinds of decisions without disclosing what information it's based on. When a physician decides, he sees you for a case and decides this is the course of action, not that, it's based on a huge number of things. Medical education, consulting with colleagues, the past 7 patients the physician has seen who had similar symptoms. The physician doesn't go ahead and tell you all the things that go into the input of the decision. And we think those are examples of little data, and here what we're essentially doing is making the same kinds of cues physicians look at more accurate, more expansive, and actually better for patient healthcare. So we think actually explicit consent is not required, but this seems very new to most patients. So although it may not be required, we do think a significant amount of resources have to be devoted to education, for example, to build patients' trust. Because I think most patients will be just terrified to think that there is a computer being involved in their health care, even if it turns out there's computers involved with their health care decision aid going on currently that they have no idea about. In terms of liability, we think that physicians who adopt these kinds of models early on will face actually significant liability concerns. The case law on electronic health records, for instance, says that physicians can be liable for harm that could have been averted had they more carefully studied their patients' medical records. So there's some concern of what's called automation bias. And also we know from the current case law, we don't have a lot, but the current case law on computer decision aid, that there's an error in the decision aid. If it turns out the error is in the software and you as a physician rely upon it and as a result give care that leads to malpractice, you nonetheless are responsible for that malpractice and will be suable for that malpractice. So this is an area where we think the involvement of FDA and FDA approval or third-party validation might have some role in cutting off liability. We should think a little bit about the way in which these things are being reviewed and whether actually the existing liability will threaten the adoption of these models that could save us billions of dollars and save patients many years in their lives. We also think there are interesting and difficult questions about choice architecture. Should it be that the physician has to override the recommendation of the model? Should they have to opt in? There are distributive consequences of how you decide the choice architecture of the model, as my colleague Cass Sunstein has written about in his Nudge book, among other places. And here we think that actually patients ought to be the ones that are empowered to make these decisions, and patient governance about how these models are designed and patient input is extremely important. The last phase is this question of broader dissemination of the model. And here the first ethical issue has to do with equitable access. The model is built from millions and millions of patient records, but will all patients benefit from the insights and the help of the model in their health care? The answer is probably not if these things are being sold on the open market. So there may be some obligations for graduated licensing or involving government as a purchaser to subsidize low-income hospitals and the like. We also think there are complicated issues related to imperfect implementation. Hospitals will probably be more ambitious in trying to adapt an out-of-the-box model, and there are liability questions about how much adaptation they do. Ideally, you want these things to be integrated with patient workflow and physician workflow, but the more integration you do, the more risk there is that the hospital themselves will take on liability. And finally, I think the biggest ethical challenge here has to do with the role of the physician in general. We're talking about a generation of physicians who are comfortable with computers, but certainly not data scientists, right? So there's really two shifts. One has to do with sophistication. How can we better train physicians to understand the data science between predictive analytics and big data? How can we get them to be the engineers and the innovators in this space? How can we get them comfortable? The other has to do more with ego, right? Physicians have long been at the center of their medical decision making, yes, aided by textbooks, aided by colleagues, aided by patients. But we think that the future, which is a heavily more data scientist, predictive analytic version of medicine, will really change the way physicians think about themselves and think about their relationship to patients. And we think those are interesting and important issues to struggle with. Okay, well, saying that now, I'm going to shift a little bit to the second topic I want to talk about, and you'll just bear with me for 1 second as I change PowerPoint slides. If I can do this, let's just see if I can switch this way. Okay, there we go. And now I just need to start the slideshow. Don't you love it when technology gets in the way? Okay, I think here we go. So the second topic I want to talk about has to do with the globalization of healthcare and the buying and selling of organs, right? So first of all, let's talk about the globalization of healthcare. This is a book I did a few years ago, and I should say disclosure, I sometimes do some consulting for people in this industry, so always good to have your disclosures up front. Medical tourism, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit greater depth in a moment, is part of a larger trend towards the globalization of healthcare. Healthcare expenditures in the U.S. were at about 18% in the 2010-2012, and that share is reported to rise or projected to rise pretty sharply. If healthcare costs were to have risen at their historical rate, the share of GDP devoted to healthcare in the United States would be projected to reach about 34%, 34% of the gross domestic product of the United States by 2040. For households that have employer-sponsored health insurance, that implies a progressively larger share of your pay going to your health care and smaller bits going to your take-home pay, which is a huge change. Also would have huge dire implications for government budgets. Almost half of current healthcare spending is covered by federal, state, and local governments. If healthcare costs continue to grow at historical rates, Medicare and Medicaid spending alone would rise to nearly 15% of the GDP in 2040. And about 1/4 of that increase is due to the aging of the population and other demographic effects, whereas 3/4 is about the trend line for healthcare costs. The Affordable Care Act, often called Obamacare, works. It'll bend those numbers a little bit, but the big idea is to ask ourselves, why should healthcare be only provided locally and not globally? Why should it be alone in these kinds of goods? So in 1817, David Ricardo, the British economist, had one of the most powerful insights in history, the theory of comparative advantage, a fundamental argument in favor of free trade among countries and of specialization among individuals. Even if there is mutual benefit from trade, even if one party, the resource-rich party, the highly skilled artisan, is more productive in every possible way than its trading counterpart, as long as each concentrates on where it has a relative productivity advantage. So we've seen this idea at work in most aspects of our daily lives: the clothes we wear, the computer I'm using to manipulate this presentation, much of the food we eat has been made elsewhere, allowing countries to focus on that which they have comparative advantage. Yes, there are definitely winners and losers distributionally, and of course, lots of talk in this election season about the TPP and NAFTA, but this global trade has lowered prices for many goods and services dramatically and made both the U.S. and other countries much wealthier. So the question is, should we think of healthcare in these terms as well? Should healthcare cease to be a service or a good provided only locally, but one be provided globally as well? So there are a few different kinds of this globalization. One aspect is medical migration, the brain drain of physicians and other healthcare practitioners, largely from the developing to the developed world. The U.S. depends heavily on foreign-trained doctors to staff its healthcare system. As of 2005, about 1/5 of all doctors practicing in the U.S. were foreign trained. This recruitment has serious effects on the supply of doctors in the developing world. So to give one very pungent example, between 86 and 95, for example, 61% of all graduates of the Ghana Medical School left their country for employment elsewhere, with about 54% going to the UK, 35% to the US, etc., etc. The effect of this migration on rich and poor nations is immense. A study estimated that roughly 3 million currently practicing healthcare professionals trained in less developed countries had migrated to more developed countries for work, and would have cost an average of $184,000 to teach each of those professionals in a more developed country, such that poor countries lost about $500 million and more developed countries saved roughly $500 billion. Huge, huge subsidy from the global poor to the global rich. In telemedicine, we have patients and providers staying put, but medical care is provided remotely. And this is everything from pretty low-tech stuff, telepsychiatry, all you need is a Skype cam or a telephone, to the very high end of telerobotics, where surgical instruments for cyber surgery can cost millions of dollars, with additional harder to quantify expenses needed to pay for the remote network of technicians who operate and maintain the robotic instrument. Many countries like India are leaders in this, and of course there's teleradiology. Do you know who's been reading your x-rays? If you came in a certain hour of the night or to a rural center, chances are your x-ray was read halfway across the world and you're never told about this. How should we think about the liability raised for this? What kind of information should be provided to patients? Then we have research and development, multi-regional clinical trials where research on promising drugs or therapy are conducted in part in developing countries, even though the fruit of that research will in the short term primarily benefit developed countries. It's estimated in 2004 that about $39 billion was spent by pharmaceutical companies on these activities outside the United States. I'm sorry, 21% of that $39 billion was spent outside the United States. By a 2005 estimate, approximately 40% of all clinical trials were being run in the developing world, with projections that this number would increase to about 50 to 70% of all clinical trials being run outside the United States. When it comes to access to healthcare and access to these drugs, it's a very different story. There's a huge populations continuing to suffer from diseases that are readily preventable, including 611,000 deaths per year from measles, 1.7 million from infectious diarrhea, 155,000 from syphilis. Although neglected diseases account for only 16.4% of the global disease burden, only 2 to 3% of the global research and development expenditures go to research directed at those diseases. So we have a huge impact of this economic globalization in terms of who benefits and who suffers. Okay, now I want to zero in on medical tourism more specifically. I wrote a book about this a couple of years ago. Medical tourism is the travel of patients from one country, the home country, to another, the destination country, for the purpose of getting health care. It's a very lucrative, growing, relatively unregulated industry. Often there are facilitators who help you choose the facility, arrange for your evaluation, guide or arrange tourism. They don't often charge you because, and this is not disclosed to you, they frequently get a kickback from the hospital to which they refer to you. This is an example of one of the advertisements you'll see for these facilitators, this one focused on Mexico. Here's another ad. I kind of love this one because it shows you the way in which the industry paints itself as being luxurious. Concierge medicine, beautiful beaches. The term medical tourism is controversial, but in some ways it's accurate because often a trip to the Taj Mahal will be mixed in with your cardiac bypass in India when you recuperate, or surgery safari, going on safari with the giraffes after you've had a facelift, because presumably they don't care too much that you're all bandaged up afterwards. And I've always found this particular ad that I'm showing you a little bit funny in that there's this pontoon and the beautiful blue water, and I'm trying to understand, will the surgery be performed on that pontoon? Why are they showing this to me? But it's really part of the marketing of this industry in terms of glamour. I wrote a book about this a couple of years ago, Patients with Passports. I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a moment. So it's useful to actually think about the industry as divided into different kinds of slices. And this photo from the bottom of the slide, by the way, is Bumrungrad Hospital in Bangkok in Thailand, one of the biggest and most successful hospitals catering to foreign patients. When you look at the interior, to me it looks much more like a Marriott conference hotel than a hospital, which I think is a compliment based on some of the hospitals I've seen around the world when I did this book. So it's useful to divide the services into three. There are treatments for services that are legal in the patient's home country and destination country, such as hip replacements, cardiac bypass, cosmetic surgery, etc. Then there's medical tourism for services that are illegal in both the patient's home and destination country, but where travel abroad may facilitate receiving the treatment due to laxer destination country enforcement. So transplant tourism, which I'll turn to in a few moments, is one of the best examples of this part of the industry. Finally, there's medical tourism for services that are illegal in the patient's home country, but legal in the destination country, what I call circumvention tourism. And good examples of this phenomenon include travel abroad for abortion, to Zurich for assisted suicide, to the US for many forms of reproductive technology. Stem cell treatments in China is also a good example, although there it has much more to do with regulatory approval than a social prohibition through the criminal law. And this kind of led to the organization of the book that I did. Here you can see a little bit of the book structure divided between the legal and the illegal and the issues being raised. But a different way of thinking about the industry is by payer type. You've got patients paying out of pocket. In the US, these are often uninsured patients who are going abroad for health care because they don't have health insurance. Again, Obamacare should curb this a little bit, but the main reason is cost. I'm going to show you some data in a second, but I like to caution this by always saying all data in this industry is very provisional. It's right probably to an order of magnitude, but wrong pretty much otherwise. So take a look at this chart. This is a chart to show you kind of the cost differential of paying for healthcare in the US versus elsewhere. So let's just take heart bypass as an example. You were paying out of pocket, they would charge you $210,000 on average. Probably you'll never pay that much. They'll have a collection agency. There's all sorts of reasons why that's not the actual price you'll pay, but that's the sticker price. An insurer pays about half of that, $94,000 if you will. But if you go to India, Thailand, Singapore, you're talking more between $10,000 to $20,000. So you could be saving, the rule of thumb here is about 80% of the costs by leaving the U.S. and going abroad to developing world in particular for these kinds of treatments. And that's causing a lot of individuals to go abroad. There's also underinsured individuals. These are people who have health insurance but are facing co-pays or deductibles or the like. There are circumvention tourists who are seeking things that are illegal when they go abroad, and then there are intermediaries who are kind of facilitating all of this travel. A second group are people who actually have health insurance but are going abroad because their health insurer is giving them an incentive to do so. And in a moment I'll tell you about a case study in the U.S. where exactly this happened. Individuals going abroad because they received a check from their insurer to go abroad. Finally, there's government-prompted medical tourism, and this is very common in particular in the EU, where we have a directive on cross-border healthcare. I've got a chapter about that in the book, talking about requiring some member states to reimburse under some conditions travel and care in other member states. There's also a big question about whether the U.S. should be doing more of this in Medicare and Medicaid. There have been estimates that under Medicare, if we could actually have a significant portion of the population go abroad, Medicare could save huge amounts of dollars by doing so. And the NHS, among others, have experimented with a little bit of this. Okay. Different way of thinking, by the way, this is just data from looking at a much larger swath of countries, but I'm sure it's pretty small on your screen, so I'm just going to jump forward. You can also think about dividing patients based on where they come from. And here when we talk about North and South, we're really talking about developed and developing countries. And there really is medical tourism of all these quadrants, and during the Q&A, I can tell you a little bit of how they're different. But I want to jump in. These are some of the players in this: destination country governance, hospitals, accreditators, insurers, home country partner organizations, industry associations. But I want to jump into some case studies just to give you a flavor at this before I switch to organ tourism. So first let's talk about Carl. This is a hypothetical person, but based on an amalgam of some real cases. Carl's 47. He's uninsured, no health insurance, lives in Milwaukee. He has severe atherosclerotic narrowing in several arteries, and the cardiologist recommends bypass surgery. In Milwaukee, out of pocket, would have cost him between $48,000 and $73,000, depending on the hospital. He can get the same surgery at Bumrungrad in Bangkok, Thailand, for 10 grand. He goes, but unfortunately he suffers an ischemic stroke, the cutting off of blood supply to the brain during the procedure. As a result, he experiences partial paralysis in his right arm, moderate speech problems, pain, depression. Should the U.S. have taken steps to discourage Carl on his trip? Should have evaluated or pre-cleared the hospital to which he went to? If he believes the stroke is the result of medical error, he may want to sue the foreign hospital. What barriers will he face if he tries to bring it in the U.S.? And I teach civil procedure, so I can tell you all about that. If knowing about these kinds of difficulties, he instead tries to sue in the foreign country, in Bangkok, what obstacles does he face in getting a lawyer and getting his claim paid for? What is the remuneration for medical malpractice in these places? Second case study, and this was based on an ABC News report that I was interviewed for. Joy is 39 years old. She's a utility worker in Hickory in the U.S. state of North Carolina. She's about 238 pounds, 5'9". She's diagnosed with severe chronic obesity, family history of diabetes and heart disease. She needs gastric sleeve surgery. She worked for HSM, a furniture and auto parts manufacturer in western North Carolina. Gary, 65 years of age, retired manager at the same plant, needs his knee replaced. What they have in common is both were induced by HSM to leave North Carolina and travel to Costa Rica for their treatment at a private hospital, the Hospital Clinica Biblica. Even with their insurance, both of them would have to have paid $3,000 out of pocket in the U.S., an amount that Joy said she wouldn't have been able to afford. But in Costa Rica, they both pay nothing. The company pays up the bill. Not only does HSM charge them nothing, but each will get a bonus check for at least $2,500, a percentage of the corporate savings and insurance costs. HSM can afford to be generous in this regard because it stands to save money from the practice. Outsourcing medical care in this way has saved it nearly $10 million in healthcare costs over 5 years. Close to 250 employees have traveled abroad for medical care, and more are scheduled to go. The knee replacement would have cost more than $50,000. In Costa Rica, it's about half that. The gastric sleeve, about $30,000. Again, about half that in Costa Rica. And the hospital is beautiful, pristine, state-of-the-art hospitals, and all the travel is paid for, and they can bring a friend or loved one with them, and they get time off from work if they're working. What could be wrong with this? They made some money getting a surgery. Doesn't that sound great? Well, it raises a series of legal and ethical questions I tackle. What obligations do home country insurance companies have to ensure the quality of foreign facilities to which they send patients? What kinds of legal liability do they bear when something goes wrong? Does the law regulate what kind of deals they can offer patients as incentives to go abroad, or whether they could even penalize patients for going abroad? What kind of insurance regulation would be most appropriate? Who pays if something goes wrong in medical malpractice? Okay, third case study. Now we're going to get to the organ tourism, organ selling. Akash, this is again an amalgam of some real-life cases, 24-year-old man living in Dhaka, the capital of Bangladesh, sees an advertisement run in the Daily Ittifaq, the local newspaper, which says that they're looking for a heartfelt request is made to good persons who could donate a kidney with the following criteria. Lists the blood donor group, says the donor has to travel for donation, says it will be performed at a U.S. university medical center, donor has to be in good health, and gives an address. Well, he contacts the number and the address, meets a broker who tells him he wants Akash to participate in the noble act of kidney donation, promises to cover all expenses and compensate him well, tells Akash that the operation is completely safe and will be in the hands of a world-renowned surgeon. Also tells him the story of the sleeping kidney, and this was found to be a common story in Bangladesh, where selling a kidney is presented as a win-win situation in which by removing one of the kidneys, the transplant surgeon awakens the other sleeping kidney through medication, and the seller is portrayed as living perfectly well with only one remaining kidney. The broker tells Akash he might even get a job or a visa out of the kidney transplant. The broker says going abroad to India for transplantation will be fun. You can eat out, shop, watch Indian movies. And Akash is offered about 100,000 taka, about 1,400 US dollars, but he's told he won't receive the entire amount until just before he enters the OR. The broker arranges a fake passport, forged legal documents for Akash that indicate that he's donating to a relative, and advises Akash to hide his identity so the Indian healthcare personnel don't reject his case. After crossing the border to India, the broker seizes his passport to ensure that he cannot return to Bangladesh before the kidney is removed. He's housed in poor accommodations, rooming with as many as 10 other sellers in a bachelor apartment. Medical tests are redone. The day before the operation, he asks for his promised money, but is now told that he will not be paid until after returning to Bangladesh. After the surgery, he notices a 20-inch scar along his side, and I've shown you some photos of these, which the surgeon could have avoided by using a laparoscopic surgery resulting in a 4-inch incision. That's what we do in the U.S., but would cost an additional $200. He's released from the hospital after 5 days and put into a less than hygienic apartment. He's returned to Bangladesh within a few days despite the doctor's orders to rest in India, and along the train route his wounds bleed a little bit. Upon returning, he experiences a decline in his health, psychological suffering. He begins to refer to himself as handicapped. He experiences pain, weakness, weight loss. He also has to confront the stigma of the 20-inch scar. People who see it refer to him as a kidney man, so he tries to hide it or make up stories about an accident. The scar interferes with his eligibility for marriage. He refers to the day of the transplant as his death day. While selling a kidney is typically illegal in places like Bangladesh and basically all around the world except for Iran, those laws are often not fully enforced, opening up a black market. Should home countries seek to criminalize the activity of their citizens who go abroad to buy kidneys? Should those patients be denied reimbursement for immunosuppressive drugs as a deterrent when they return home, or is that too draconian? Would a regulated kidney market in the United States be better than this prohibition? What kind of international, domestic, hard and soft law would best effectuate a ban if we wanted to have one? Okay, so let me say a few words about those questions I've just said now, and then I'm going to turn into Q&A because I want to engage with you a little bit more. So this is some data on kidney sellers in Pakistan. I'll show you some data from India as well. When it comes to the international market, we see most of the people are poor. They're trying to buy themselves out of bonded labor. They're working as domestic servants. They're trying to afford a market stall or to pay a dowry for getting married. Most are settled with debt. They're promised between about $1,200 and $3,000 US dollars for their kidney, but actually none of them are actually paid that. The mean amount they pay instead is usually about 2/3 of what they were promised. Here's some more data from Pakistan showing you that their health was pretty good before, but a very small percentage said that their health was good after they returned from Pakistan. 62 said that they, six from Pakistan to Pakistan from after the transplant. 62% said they felt physically weak. 36.8% said their health was poor and they felt ill, suggesting that they had to stop working for periods of time. When it came to finances, 85% said there was no improvement in their lives and they were either still in debt or had not achieved their objectives. Bangladesh, similar results, although we actually also have cases involving mustans, essentially thugs, threatening to beat someone up if they don't go through with it. Lots of stigma, and again, we find that the seller's health in terms of self-reports profoundly deteriorated in the post-vending phase. They had physical problems, severe psychological suffering, refer to themselves as handicapped and the like. Chennai, India, very similar data. I'm not going to belabor it. When we look at recipients, this is people who've had transplant tourism and come back. We have a few studies, one from UCLA. We see actually much higher rates of rejection of kidney in the first year. And we see no overall difference in the incidence of infection in the tourist versus the matched cohort from the U.S. But the infections the patients did have much more severe. Tourists are much more likely to be hospitalized due to infections with a range of 1 to 744 days in the hospital. Canales' study from Minnesota found that graft and patient survival were comparable to results obtained for patients transplanted in the U.S., but actually poor communication of information on induction therapy, immunosuppressive, post-transplant courses of treatment, and the like. In 3 of the cases, the patients were sent back to the U.S. in the midst of a crisis relating to wound infection, seizure, acute rejection. Prasad et al. From St. Michael's Hospital in Canada, somewhat similar results. So we can talk a little bit about this during the Q&A, what the ethical arguments are involved in thinking about whether we should allow these kinds of markets. And I should say here, although I have a stronger opinion against selling and buying organs in the international market, because I think it involves too much risk and too difficult to kind of regulate as a regulator, the same may not be true if we're talking about a regulated market or incentives being offered in the United States, but we can talk about that in the Q&A. The last thing I will say that before opening up to Q&A is imagine we were serious about trying to deter this kind of transplant tourism. So again, as I mentioned, it turns out all countries abroad except for Iran, and we can talk about Iran, why it's different, have a prohibition on buying and selling a kidney. And yet we see lax destination country enforcement in places like India, Bangladesh, the Philippines, Pakistan, and the like. So that doesn't seem to be working. We have some professional self-regulation, for example, the Declaration of Istanbul involving nephrologists, which have been helpful to some extent in curbing and trying to push some of the foreign countries to try to curb it themselves, but this has had limited effect. In the U.S., it's illegal under NOTA, the National Organ Transplant Act, to buy and sell a kidney in the United States, but it's not illegal to go abroad as a U.S. citizen. Should we extraterritorialize our criminal prohibition and make it a crime in the U.S. to buy a kidney in India? Should we invoke international criminal law and the International Criminal Court? Should we go so far as to try to discourage people from going abroad by denying them insurance coverage for immunosuppressive drugs needed to prevent kidney rejection when they return from the U.S.? Should it be illegal for insurance companies or for the government to pay for those drugs for somebody who's violated the prohibition on going abroad? And lastly, how can we improve the supply of organs locally? Should we rely on more cadaveric recovery through opt-out, clearer doctor authority to override, family, ideas like social media and Facebook status, I'm a donor? Are these going to make a real dent in this, or really are we so far off the mark that even if we did all of these and improved our recovery rate of organs, we're still going to see a significant shortage? So let me stop there. I'm looking forward to taking your questions. I'm going to leave a slide with some of my information towards the end of this. Here we go. where you can learn more about my work and also about the online course I'm going to be teaching through HLex starting right after Labor Day. But for now, let me take your questions, and I'm looking forward to it.
Great. Our first question is, regarding phase one, what about pre-existing data that has already been acquired for other purposes?
Yeah, so Facebook is interesting. So Facebook, one of the things that's very interesting is in America, we have a very strong protection of human subjects research if you are doing research. And typically it means you are receiving federal funding or your institution's receiving federal funding. You have to check the box and you're governed by what's called the Common Rule. You're also governed for medical information by HIPAA, the Health Information Portability Act. Well, many people hate that act, but that's another story entirely, which covers kind of transmission of information from patients to the physicians and from one covered entity to another. When it comes to private information shared by Facebook, none of these kinds of laws govern. So Facebook is able to do things as a researcher that the U.S. government, that Harvard University would not be able to do, which creates a huge incentive for data scientists who are interested in this kind of stuff to go to Facebook. So if you've shared information with Facebook, the only protection you have is the terms of use of Facebook. And really, typically speaking, that'll be enforced by Facebook, not by you. Now, there have been some class actions occasionally. So Google, one of its products, which was kind of supposed to be a competitor to Facebook, actually I think Bill Rubenstein on our faculty helped form a class action, and they got some kind of protection when people's friends' networks and the like were accidentally disclosed to the public. But for the most part, you're relying on tort law, not bioethics law or health law to protect your medical information in these contexts, which is very tricky. I'll just mention one more project I'm working on from another grant-related activity we're doing that should hopefully be published pretty soon and out there in the world, which is the recruitment of patients from social media. So if you, for example, are part of a Facebook group of cancer survivors, can researchers go in there and contact you via Facebook to recruit you? If you are part of a group involving the LGBT community, can you be recruited for pre-exposure prophylaxis treatment to prevent HIV/AIDS, for example? What are the limits on this? And this is an area where we have very little guidance from the federal government, and we've been writing to think about what might be available.
Next question. Are there answers to the liability questions you raised in the medical tourism portion? Can employers be held liable if they facilitate the medical tourism? An example you gave and complications result?
So great question, and here's the point where I should say there's people all over the world listening to this, and I'm not licensed to practice in all their jurisdictions, so this is not legal advice, so treat this as kind of an academic discussion and exercise. So first let me just say from the patient's perspective, if you're an individual patient who's been aggrieved and you have to sue a foreign provider, a foreign hospital, you're in real trouble civil procedurally. Probably going to face no personal jurisdiction, you're going to face a forum non-conveniens claim. Choice of law will probably be the foreign law, and if you look at Indian, Singapore, Malaysian, Mexican law, all vastly less remunerative. And if you have to sue abroad, you're going to have trouble finding a physician willing to take your a lawyer willing to take your case, trouble getting expert witnesses and the like. So I've talked a lot about whether arbitral processes or insurance process, because there is medical malpractice insurance for patients who engage in medical tourism offered by Lloyd's of London, among others, might be a better solution, forcing these to be grouped in with your policy. When it comes to suing your employer, and here I should say the employers that are currently using medical tourism in this way tend to be self-insured employers, and the reason has to do that self-insured employers are, through ERISA preemption, freed from many of the restrictions of state insurance law, and many of the state insurance laws that are meant to govern health maintenance organizations and preferred provider organizations actually get in the way of doing medical tourism and using it robustly. So the self-insured firms that are sending patients abroad do have liability for negligent selection. They have to review the credentialing of the physicians. They have to do some due diligence. But I will say for the most part, this has not proved a particularly robust theory when it comes to domestic employers picking domestic doctors. It's relatively untested when it comes to medical tourism. We have no reported cases involving someone suing either their employer or a foreign physician or a foreign hospital in the United States. But most of us who work in this area and think about the kinds of grounds available to sue your employer think that the grounds for negligent selection and the theories available to you are not particularly robust. So I often advise patients to think about self-insuring through one of these insurance products, and I advise employers to think about whether they can, in good faith, create arbitral processes or insurance processes to make sure that things are okay for their patients who are hurt. Because one thing here is that employers do share, and they have some kind of aligned interests with the patients going abroad. They want these people to return to the employment. They want them to work. They don't want to have to retrain these patients. So in my view, there may be opportunities here for employers and patients to work together to make sure they have recourse if something does go wrong.
Another question, how will big data or predictive analytics take into account disparities in terms of the quality of patient data outcomes for patients of various races and socioeconomic status where historically such digital healthcare info may not be available? Will such patients be less likely to get the ICU bed if based on predictive analytics?
So great question. So let me take it in a couple parts. So the first to say, there is a disparity question in terms of which hospitals will use the predictive analytics engines, and that's why I said there may need to be government subsidization or graduated licensing to make sure that whoever gives their data gets to benefit. Now, in terms of the data pool, what you want is robust and representative data. The more data you have about particular subgroups of the population, be they racial, socioeconomic status, and the like, the better the predictions you can make are. If there is gaps in that data, your ability to make predictions and your confidence about that goes down dramatically. Now, the effects of that lack of confidence, lack of accuracy, lack of predictive accuracy in terms of whether it means those patients end up getting more or less from the model is a little bit unpredictable. You could imagine a case where if we knew more about population X, we would give them less resources than we do currently, whereas if we knew, so that actually the lack of information ends up benefiting them. But I will say in general, putting aside the big data elements about this, just if you think about continuity of care, about switching providers over time, about how good things are recorded, it's a real problem for minority healthcare if physicians aren't recording in electronic health records and aren't able to use that. And my own view is to the extent we're seeing that in America, it's something that the federal government ought to be trying to do its best to rectify, and probably not through an unfunded mandate, but through support, because what we want is a healthcare system that includes everybody's data, where everybody is contributing and everybody's benefiting. But the reality of today's America, we know, is quite different. If you look at something like the Dartmouth Atlas, which shows you great maps of the U.S., you'll see within a given state huge differences in the quality of care and the quality of treatment and the patient outcomes. A lot of it, though, by the way, even though race is a big piece of that, geography turns out to be a huge piece as well, and actually the rural-urban divide eats up a lot of the reason why we see these disparities, which is interesting.
Another question, could you speak a little more about why Iran is different when it comes to paying for kidneys?
Yeah, absolutely. So Iran has an interesting kind of mixed system, and essentially in Iran, it's illegal to buy a kidney, but it's legal to sell it. But there's a single buyer of kidneys, and that's the government, so there's a monopsony. So the government is the only authorized buyer, and in theory, and I say this in theory because it's very hard to verify what actually is happening in Iran at the moment, in theory, the government buys organs from anybody who wants to sell them after a pre-qualifying psychological evaluation, and then with those organs engages in what we do, which is to have a distribution system based on priority setting, best outcomes, age, geography, and the like. So they do what we do, but they buy all the kidneys and then have the government distribute it. Now, there is in the literature some discussion of little gifts, and maybe they're not so little, paid from organ recipients to the donors, and there's some suggestion that this system of no selling at all is a little exaggerated, but it's an alternative and a different system. And for people who are open to the idea of selling kidneys or the government buying kidneys but are worried about the distributional impacts and only the rich will receive kidneys in such a market like Iran's is an interesting kind of middle step where the distribution system works as it does now, but on the front end, the government is empowered to actually buy those organs. And that's not to say that such a system doesn't have problems. You may be concerned about problems about exploitation, commodification, and the like. But it does try to target one problem, which is the idea of unfair distribution of organs.
Final question, why are hospitals allowed to charge uninsured persons twice as much as Medicare or the insurance companies pay the hospital?
Yeah, so this is all about bargaining, right? So you as an individual go to the hospital. The hospital says this is the rate. And by the way, as an uninsured individual, if you ever need health care, I hope most of you have health insurance out there, but if you don't, if you're a U.S. individual, it's extremely difficult to know ahead of time what you're going to pay. Huge numbers of hidden charges. The surgeon who came in, and this many surgeons, they can't tell you ahead of time who the anesthesiologist is, how they're billing. Medical billing is extremely complicated. Essentially, though, the insurance companies have leverage, right? Especially in a market with fewer insurance companies or many hospitals. And they negotiate better prices than do individual people. Same is true of Medicaid and Medicare, right? This idea that we can have negotiated prices. The government sets what it's willing to pay in reimbursement and will not pay any more than that. Individuals who go in don't face that. And this is one reason why many people are open to systems more like those in Canada, in Israel, in the UK, in Australia, where we have more individuals being covered by the governmental plan, because the government can do this kind of bargaining at the macro level. On the other hand, you talk to physicians, they'll tell you the result of that bargaining is they get stiffed. They get paid much less than they would like to. But when it comes to private insurers, a lot depends on market concentration, which in turn depends on the enforcement of hospital mergers and antitrust law and the like.
We have time for one more question. I don't see how the black box analytics model will work both from a clinician and patient perspective. Even Watson allows clinicians to see the source studies. Is there not an open source way to do this?
So it's tricky, right, because of the complexity of this, right? So imagine it is the case that I know that 46-year-old women who've had the following 3 procedures and who weigh between this and that and have this BMI, that it turns out this treatment is better than that treatment, X is better than Y for them, right? If you were so what does it mean to know how we arrived at that answer? If it's machine learning, essentially the idea is the computer is learning as it's going and is looking at associations and creating its own inductive hypotheses. Very hard for anyone to know exactly where that association came from, except to say the association is in there in the data. If, on the other hand, you're testing inductive hypotheses directly, so you're saying, for example, I think that people with this profile will benefit from more readmission or more follow-up than those people, and you run the numbers through the EHRs and you see the answer, that's something that can be made transparent. So I'm in favor of transparency. My friends in computer science tell me that when it comes to machine learning in particular, that kind of transparency is very hard to show anyone. And in particular, I think it'll be very difficult for clinicians to understand where that's coming from in terms of individual patients and their relationship. But, you know, I'm hoping I'm wrong. It would be nice if I'm wrong and that things like Watson do have patient-facing kind of services and the like. But my own expectation is that a lot of it will be pretty opaque to the patient and to the physician. Great. So I think we're now ready to wrap up the Q&A. And I'm going to turn it back over to Karen.
Thanks again to Professor Cohen and to you for joining us today. I hope you enjoyed today's session as much as I did. If you'd like to review any part of today's webinar, the recording of this program will be available online within 1 week. I also hope that you'll join us for our next HLex Open Lecture on June 15th, featuring Professor Emily Broad-Lieb, speaking about the future of food, how the Food Law and Policy Clinic is improving our food system. You can access today's recording and register for the June 15th HLex Open Lecture on our website, alumni.law.harvard.edu/HLex. And be sure to fill out the short survey we email you about today's event to give us feedback and help shape future programs. Again, Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.